What's up, everybody? Welcome back. This is episode 5. I'm your host, Calvin Maclure, and this is our RP-1 1.8.1 playthrough. We pick up exactly where we left off. In episode 4, we performed a series of flights with the KSP-3. We performed the first flight where it was a pure speed run and we hit just shy of Mach 4. We followed that up with an altitude run and a bit of scientific payloads to see what we could accomplish with those, and we ended up hitting a 78 kilometer peak altitude, which is pretty good, especially in light of the fact that the current cockpit configuration only allows for 75. So we had 2 successful back-to-back flights. We introduced the Dash 3A, which has basically just a more narrow wing profile for reduced drag. And we ended the episode with the design of the 3B, which is the 4-engine variant. So picking up where we left off, we are flying the 3A again, which we've turned around. And we are aiming for that 430 meter per second contract in between 13 and 15 kilometers. Right off the start, we run into some issues where one of the engines fails to ignite. We should be fine. We have more than enough thrust. At 3 engines on full throttles, we were able to hit just over 1200 meters per second. So for 430, 450, 2 at reduced throttle is more than enough. But right here we get into some more issues where the second engine partially fails and then fails catastrophically, but in a rather serendipitous manner, because when that engine let go like that, we were 1 second away from completing the contract. So with one engine still up and running, the contract is complete and the objective of the flight was met. All we had to do now was make our way back home. Looking at what we have to work with next in terms of contracts, it looks like we're going to be hitting a series of altitude targets starting at 45 and 5 kilometer intervals. That is something we can easily achieve in the 3A. Remember, in episode 4 we hit 78, so hitting 40s and 50s and 60s should be more than doable, provided we don't run into any engine issues. In between the shooting of this next flight and the previous, I updated a bunch of mods, RP-1, RO engines, Realism Overhaul RP-1, and one of the issues that was introduced in one of the latest versions of RP-1 is what happened here with the air launch, where the airplane kind of starts and tumbles all over the place. It becomes really hard to recover it. But we managed to recover, even though we lost about 24 seconds of burn time, which is quite a lot. We lost 2 kilometers of our starting altitude, which isn't too bad. We can make up for that fairly easily. Our target altitude of 45 kilometers should be well within reach with the amount of fuel we still have. contrasting the numbers between the 3A and the 3B, you can see that even though we lost 24 seconds of burn time, we were still able to, for the same speed, hit an additional 20 kilometers worth of altitude. So a noticeable improvement in performance from that fourth engine. The trip back home to landing was a little longer than I would have cared for. Still getting adjusted to the 3's performance and how far we should or shouldn't be launching from the site. And from what you can see, we're not too far. Like, it's not that gliding is going to be an issue. We've got good glide characteristics. We can cover quite a bit of distance, especially since we're typically coming in from a good amount of altitude and speed. It's really more a question of time. What I was doing here is I was, again, just taking advantage of the altitude and speed that we still had and running some of the basic experiments that we could run to crunch a few more science points. And here you've got a nice shot of the air brakes and that lower ventral split air brake, which I thought looked pretty good. But I hope you liked what you just saw, because that's going to be the last of it. When we came in for landing, I guess I hit kind of hard, just a little too much, and that ventral air brake ended up clipping into the runway and breaking off. But nevertheless, a very good and successful flight. We reached the objective, which was to hit 45 kilometers. In an attempt to further squeeze out performance out of the 3B, we were able to apply the updates to the XLR11 that the latest tech update gave us, which is mostly going to be around improved burn time capabilities. I also tweaked the wing positioning to try and improve the performance of the aircraft aerodynamically. But before we move on to more flights, we go to this, the latest addition to our repertoire. Amongst many of the very noteworthy updates and improvements to the game in 1.8.1, the plume and the sound of the new engines is simply outstanding. The mock diamonds and everything, hats off to the mod developers for that. The Silver Brandt BB is a 3-stage sounding rocket. The third stage is powered by an Aerobee engine, which has been upgraded. The second stage is powered by the same engine we use on the X-Planes, which is the XLR11, and the first stage uses the XLR43. The Silver Brandt BB is designed to have a gap in between igniting the second stage engine and stage set, because the XLR11s are low thrust and we want to hit that higher altitude where the air is thinner and we don't have to compensate so much against any kind of yaw in pitch undesired aero effects. But as you'll see here, I ended up waiting too long to ignite it, and what happened is that the gravity vector pulled us down below the horizon and we were just not able to recover from that, and we ended up into a great fiery explosion. Moving on to the second flight of the 3B, again trying to go for altitudes, we again run into that air launch issue. And yes, I was reminded after the fact by someone on the Discord that there is that hack gravity fix where you can just activate it, leave it at 1G, and it actually fixes this. I only found out or ran into that fix later on, so you'll see that our next flight still run into this Principia issue. But nevertheless, again, just like the previous flight, we were able to recover in time to burn the engines long enough and reach our 50-kilometer mark. We were finally able also to unlock the high-test peroxide thrusters. So those had quite a lot more power than the helium ones, which were really kind of useless. And at this altitude, finally now they're starting to come into their own, where we're starting to get some authority out of them. There's still enough air that aerodynamic effects are noticeable, but certainly as we start going higher and higher, those high-test peroxide thrusters are going to become increasingly necessary. As we were coming in for the landing, I ended up too high and too fast, and in trying to get her down, I ended up overcorrecting and hitting the nose gear really hard into the ground. For a moment during the flight, I actually thought that was going to be the end of our pilot. But much to my relief, she took the impact and survived, and everybody was able to walk away safely. So with that flight out of the way, we've officially got the 50-kilometer mark out of the way. The next target will be 55. One of the huge benefits in having the upgraded XLR11 engines is their runtime is 6 minutes, and with the amount of fuel we have on board, we currently run ours for just over 2. So what that means is we can get up to 3 flights roughly without having to swap out the engines in between, which gives us a really fast turnaround time. And in my attempts again here to ever fine-tune and improve the performance of the 3B, you'll see me do some minor tweaking to the wing positioning just to try and get a preferred location for the center of lift. In this flight, we were supposed to go for that 55-kilometer mark, and then again, that Principia issue caused us to completely spin out. We were in a flat spin, and there was just no recovering it. By the time I managed to get control back, we were so low and slow that I decided to just abort the run. I started dumping fuel to lighten the weight of the aircraft as much as possible. It does weigh around 15 to 17 tons fully loaded, and just like we had done it with the Dash 2 in episode 1 or 2, and prepared for a water landing. It was looking fine, but once we actually hit the water, that happened. So I just hit the abort button and I punched out of there. I always make a point to build my crafts with escape capabilities. So like you just saw there, if we hadn't had that built into the Dash 3, our pilot would have been gone with that incident, more than likely. But we have it. It's not a 0-0 capability system, but for the largest portions of the flight, if we need to, we can bail out. So with that, it was a terrible flight, but at least our pilot made it back safely. The next step was to take the recovered cockpit and rebuild the aircraft. While we were waiting for the X-3B to be finished building, our silver Brandt rocket was ready for the second attempt at the 3,000 kilometer downrange contract. What looked like the start of a good flight very shortly turned into a bad flight with the engine cutting off not long after we'd left the pad. But back with our XSP-3B, this is its fourth flight, and now this time the hat gravity fix was put into effect, and you can see the launch went completely normally, and the target this time around was that 55 kilometer mark. So contrary to the previous flight, this one went off without a hitch. The launch was good, all the engines ignited and burned to depletion. And at 55 kilometers of altitude, you could see me there kind of fool around again with the RCS thrusters because I wanted to see and feel how the aircraft behaved at those higher altitudes. The 40 to 50 kilometer mark ends up being this kind of weird gray zone where your RCS thrusters will give you some authority, as do the aerodynamics, but neither of them are sufficient, and so the aircraft tends to be rather sluggish in its response. So all in all, a good flight, no outstanding issues at all. The aircraft behaved exactly like what we wanted it to, and we hit our 55 kilometer altitude target. Taking advantage of that 6-minute burn time, all we had to do this time around was recover the aircraft, refuel it, reattach it, and launch it again, and we were able to do that in less than 15 days. The objective for this flight was to try and hit 1500 meters per second, but right off the bat that got off to a really bad start with one of our engines quitting on us. The plan was to level off once we reached roughly 20 kilometers worth of altitude where the air is a little thinner. Keeping track of the fuel gauge, I noticed we're starting to run low on fuel, so I decided to try and nosedive it to see if we can just get raw speed, but the aerodynamic forces ended up being far too substantial, as did the heating, and then we started burning parts off of the aircraft. The bad situation ended up being a worse situation. I knew I had to pull us out of that, but when I tried, the aerodynamic forces tore the wings off the aircraft and broke it into I don't know how many pieces. So for the second time this episode, we actually had to punch out of the aircraft. It just goes to show how important building this kind of a system into your designs is. If I hadn't done this, we would have had 2 deaths in this single episode, we'd have no pilots, and we'd have to recruit more, which would also cause us to take a substantial financial hit. But because we built these into the designs, both times when the situation got bad, we were able to abort, pull out, and come back home safe. So that is going to wrap up episode 5. A bit of a tough one. We had some successful flights and we had some pretty serious failures as well. Hence the title, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Thanks for watching and see you on the next flight.